Tonight we begin with a thought that feels too large to hold comfortably, yet too quiet to ignore. Tonight we notice that doorways were once taller, ceilings once higher, staircases once broader than any practical need. Tonight we begin with the unsettling idea that the world may not have always been built for bodies shaped like yours. So before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for the future clips and give me some encouragement. And as you settle in, I invite you to share your local location and the time you're listening right now. Somewhere in the world, others are listening to too. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You're standing in front of an old structure. You do not know its name yet, only its feeling. The doors rise far above your head, tall and narrow, like they were waiting for someone longer-legged, broader-shouldered, slower to bend bows. You step closer, and the stone does not feel decorative. It feels intentional. Heavy, certain. Why would anyone build like this? At first, you tell yourself what you have been taught to tell yourself. Ceremony, symbolism, ego, power displayed through excess. That is always the explanation offered, isn't it? When scale makes no sense, we are told it was meant to impress. When proportions feel wrong, we are told they were meant to intimidate. And so you nod, politely, and move on, but tonight you do not move on. Tonight you notice how often this happens. Not in one city, not in one country, but everywhere. Europe, Asia, the Americas, old courthouses, abandoned hospitals, cathedrals, train stations, orphanages, asylums. Buildings from a particular era all share the same strange habit. They seem to expect taller occupants. You run your fingers along a banister that sits too high to rest your arm comfortably. You climb steps whose rise strains your knees. You stand beneath windows that begin far above eye level, as if eye level once meant something else. And a question begins to whisper. What if these were not made for you? The whisper grows louder as you drift through old photographs. Not paintings, photographs. That detail matters. Black and white images frozen in time, showing men standing beside doors that make them look like children. Showing furniture that seems awkwardly large. Showing tools, carts and machines whose handles stretch upward as if grasped by larger hands. Again you hear the familiar answers, perspective tricks, camera distortion, early photography errors. But the excuses feel thinner now. You begin to notice something else. These buildings are often attributed to forgotten name, Tartaria. Sometimes Great Tartary, sometimes simply Tartary, stretched across old maps like a quiet continent-sized secret. On those maps, Tartaria is not a footnote. It is not a rumour. It is vast, organised, labelled with borders, cities and flags. Yet in modern classrooms, it barely exists. How does an empire disappear without a war everyone remembers? As you follow this thread, another appears beside it, darker and more unsettling. Stories of giants, not fairy tale giants, not the clumsy creatures of bedtime books, but giants described as human, proportioned, intelligent, wearing clothes, building, ruling, working. You hear of skeletons dug up in the 1800s, reported in newspapers before being quietly removed. You hear of museums that once displayed oversized bones, only to later deny ever having them. You hear of photographs that circulate briefly, then vanish into private collections. And always, the laughter follows. Giants? Come on, be serious. Laughter is powerful, it seals doors more effectively than locks. You begin to wonder when laughter became the official response to curiosity. The story you are entering tonight does not ask you to believe, it only asks you to notice patterns, to walk gently through forbidden rooms, to ask why certain questions make people uncomfortable while others do not. You notice that the fall of Tartaria, whatever that truly means, seems to coincide with a global shift. Cities are rediscovered. Buildings are repurposed. Populations appear suddenly, as if from nowhere, filling streets and homes already built. Where did they come from? At the same time, the giants vanish. Not dramatically, not with a final battle etched into textbooks. They fade. They shrink into myth. They are reclassified as exaggerations, hoaxes, misunderstandings. Their bones are relabeled as mammoth or mastodon. Their tools are reinterpreted. Their buildings are reassigned. History does not deny them directly. It does something more subtle. It forgets them. You begin to sense that Tartaria and the giants are not two separate mysteries. but one story told in two voices. One speaks of an empire erased, the other speaks of a people removed, and somewhere in between is a reason no one says out loud. Imagine for a moment a civilization where height is not rare, where being 12, 14, even 16 feet tall is not monstrous, but normal. Imagine how such beings would build, how they would design doors, stairs, furniture, cities. Imagine how small you would feel walking through their world. Now imagine what would happen if they disappeared suddenly. Who would inherit their cities? Would you tear them down, or would you move in, adjust what you could, and explain away the rest? Tonight, you are not here to accuse anyone. You are here to listen, to follow the soft trail of inconsistencies, to notice that the world sometimes feels like a hand-me-down, tailored for someone else, hurriedly altered for you. You think of orphan trains, of children relocated in massive numbers, their origins undocumented, their family histories erased. You think of census resets, of fires that conveniently destroyed records, of wars whose aftermath reorganized borders and narratives. You think of how often the word reset appears in whispered conversations. Could the fall of Tartaria have been less about conquest and more about replacement? And if giants existed, if they truly walked this earth alongside smaller humans, would their disappearance not be the most destabilizing event imaginable? Would it not require silence, ridicule, and careful rewriting to prevent questions? You pause here, letting the thought drift rather than land. The tone of this story is not fear. It is curiosity. It is the gentle curiosity of a wise old voice, speaking slowly, knowing some truths must be approached like sleeping animals, softly, patiently, without sudden movement. You're not being asked to believe in giants. You are being asked to notice that the world sometimes feels scaled wrong, that maps once showed something we no longer discuss, that architecture remembers even when people forget. As you settle deeper into this journey, the questions will grow larger, but the voice will remain calm. We will walk through evidence, through whispers, through possibilities. We will never shout, we will never argue, we will think together. Because whether giants once ruled beside Tartaria, or whether the story is something more symbolic, one thing is certain: something big is missing. And tonight, as your breathing slows and the world grows quieter, you have taken the first step into that absence. You drift next into the quiet rooms of old maps, where paper smells faintly of dust and patience. Here, nothing moves quickly. Ink rests where it was placed centuries ago, unbothered by modern opinions. You lean over a table and unfold a chart that once guided sailors, traders, and kings. It does not look uncertain, it does not look mythical, it looks official. Borders are drawn with confidence, cities are named without hesitation, and across an enormous stretch of land a single word repeats itself like a steady heartbeat. Tartary. Not a corner, not a rumour, a continent-spanning presence, Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary. You notice how casually it appears. No question marks, no apologetic footnotes, just labels, placed as naturally as France or Persia. Whoever drew this map expected the viewer to already know what Tartary was, and yet you were never taught this. You trace the boundaries with your finger, feeling the strange mismatch between what is shown and what you remember being told. How does something this large simply leave the story? How does a name once printed boldly become a historical ghost? Maps, you realize, are not neutral objects. They are declarations. They tell you who matters, who exists, and who has power. When something disappears from maps, it does not fade accidentally. It is removed deliberately, quietly, and usually with good reasons no one wants to discuss before bedtime. You notice something else now. The scale of Tartary feels wrong, not politically but physically. The distances between cities seem vast, yet the infrastructure implied by the map suggests unity, coordination, and control. Roads, trade routes, star-shaped fortresses. This was not a loose collection of tribes wandering aimlessly. This was organized, advanced, and strangely oversized. You look at illustrations accompanying some of these maps. Travelers' sketches, early engravings, people stand beside gates, walls, and towers that dwarf them unnaturally. The proportions feel off in the same way those doorways did back in the first structure you visited. Again, you feel that quiet tug. What if scale itself is the clue? If Tartaria was home to beings larger than modern humans, its architecture would not just look grand, it would look logical to them. A 12-foot doorway would be convenience, not excess. A staircase with towering steps would be normal. A city planned with wide avenues and immense plazas would feel comfortable, not theatrical. And when those beings vanished, the cities would remain awkward, overbuilt, misunderstood. You notice that as Tartaria disappears from maps in the 18th and 19th centuries, new labels take its place. Empires fracture the space into manageable names. Borders tighten. The vastness shrinks. Suddenly, everything fits more neatly into the modern story of nation-states and progress. You wonder, is history uncomfortable with things that are too big? You flip to another map later this time. Tartary is gone. In its place are smaller regions, each with new rulers, new flags, new explanations. The paper looks cleaner, simpler, but also thinner, like a blanket pulled over something lumpy beneath. No one tells you Tartaria fell in a single decisive war. There is no universally agreed upon date, no dramatic last stand. Instead, the empire dissolves into vagueness, administrative changes, reclassification, outdated terminology. You've heard this kind of language before. It's the language used when certainty would raise questions. Then, quietly, the giants follow the same path. Once spoken of openly, they are gradually softened into metaphors, biblical allegories, genetic anomalies, misidentified bones. The same timeline that erases Tartaria also shrinks its people. Coincidence is a comforting word. Tonight, it feels insufficient. You imagine standing on a Tartarian road centuries ago. The ground beneath you is stone laid with care. The buildings around you are tall, not because they want to intimidate, but because they are practical. Shadows fall differently here. The world feels slower, heavier, more deliberate. Beside you, footsteps land with a deeper rhythm, not monstrous, not frightening, just heavier than yours. You do not look up in fear, you look up in familiarity. This is normal here. Now imagine waking one day and those footsteps are gone. The buildings remain, but something essential has vanished. Maintenance falters, knowledge fragments. Smaller humans move in, adapting as best they can. They add floors, they lower ceilings, they brick up windows, they explain away what they cannot change. And when children ask why the doors are so tall, decoration, they say gently. Old world style. You notice how often this explanation appears. As you linger in the map room, you realize something unsettling. The erasure is not aggressive. It is careful. Tartaria is not condemned as evil. Giants are not declared demons. They are simply laughed at, minimized, forgotten. This is how uncomfortable such truths are handled. When destroying them would draw attention. You think of how modern people react to the idea of giants. The immediate smirk, the raised eyebrow, the polite disengagement. The way curiosity is quietly discouraged, not through force, but through embarrassment. You ask yourself, who benefits from giants being impossible? If giants existed, history would no longer belong solely to the small. Power hierarchies would look different. Inheritance would look different. Ownership of land, cities, and monuments would need re-examination. It would be inconvenient. You fold the map slowly, feeling its weight linger even as it closes. Something about it refuses to be neatly put away. The ink may have faded, but the confidence with which it was drawn has not. Tartaria was real enough to be mapped. Giants were real enough to be recorded. Their disappearance shares a rhythm, a tempo, a silence. As you leave the map room, the questions do not demand answers. They simply walk beside you now, unhurried, like a companion on a long road. The night deepens. The voice guiding you remains low even, unafraid. There is no rush. The story of giants and Tartaria was not erased in a day. It will not be remembered in one night. For now, it is enough to notice that when something vast disappears from both land and memory at the same time, it is worth listening to what the silence is trying to say. You find yourself now beneath flickering lantern light, where curiosity once paid admission. The air smells of sawdust, ink, and faint deception. This is not a palace or a map room. This is a travelling show. In the 1800s, people gathered in tents and halls to witness wonders. Two-headed calves, mechanical miracles, fossils hauled from distant lands, and always, quietly advertised in bold ink, the promise of giants. You step closer to a yellowed gun poster. Giant skeleton discovered. The letters are confident, almost bored, as if such a thing required no dramatic flourish. Inside the exhibit, you imagine a massive ribcage laid out on a table, femurs longer than a man's arm, skulls too large to be mistaken for anything familiar. These were not whispered rumours. Newspapers reported them openly, town by town, state by state, measurements included, witnesses named, sometimes even photographs taken, and then the trail ends. You notice how the articles stop mid-decade, how bones are sent to universities and never mentioned again, how museums that once displayed oversized remains later deny ever possessing them, how explanations arrive long after the evidence has vanished. Mastodon, mammoth, misidentification. You hear the words spoken softly, confidently, as if repetition alone could turn them true. But something feels wrong. You have seen mammoth skeletons. You have seen how their joints fit, how their skulls curve, how their tusks dominate the narrative. What was described in those early reports does not always match. The bones were human in proportion, upright, balanced, designed to walk tall beneath a heavy sky. You notice something else, the timing. These discoveries peak during the same century. Tartaria fades from maps. The same century orphan trains fill cities. The same century massive buildings are suddenly constructed in implausibly short time frames. The same century history begins to feel crowded. You begin to suspect that the travelling shows were not inventing giants, but revealing them too late. The world was already changing. Central authorities were forming, science was professionalizing, knowledge was being standardized, loose bones did not fit neatly into textbooks, and so they were collected, not preserved. Collected. You imagine a quiet meeting. Scholars, clergy, officials, perhaps not conspirators, just caretakers of order. Giants imply instability. Giants imply questions no one wants children asking. Giants imply that humans are not the sole measure of the world. Better to quietly absorb the evidence. Better to rename it. Better to let the carnival look foolish in hindsight. You notice how easily ridicule works retroactively. Once an idea is framed as entertainment, it becomes safe to dismiss. Of course they believed in giants, people say, smiling. They also believed in mermaids. But the newspapers did not smile. They measured. They described. They documented. You think of how many things once considered fringe later became fact. Germs, meteorites, continental drift. Each was laughed at before it was accepted. Laughter, you realize, is not proof of falsehood. It is often a sign of discomfort. You walk deeper into this imagined exhibit hall. You see showmen standing beside skeletons, knowing they have something rare, but not knowing how dangerous rarity can be. Some may have exaggerated, some may have faked, but not all. The consistency across reports suggests a source beneath the spectacle. Real bones? And where do bones come from? From burial. You remember Tartarian lands described as vast, ancient, layered. How many burial grounds were disturbed during expansion? How many remains were unearthed during railroad construction, city planning, canal digging? How many were removed before questions could form? You begin to see the pattern as a slow hand closing over evidence. The giants did not disappear suddenly. They were reduced, first to curiosities, then to errors, then to jokes, then to silence. And yet their absence leaves a shape. You feel it when you stand beside massive stone block no modern crane could easily lift. You feel it when you see tools too large for average grip. You feel it when architecture seems to assume strength beyond modern capacity. The showmen, you realize, were not the villains of this story. They were the last to speak too loudly. Once institutions took control of knowledge, the tone changed. Evidence became curated. Only what fit the new human-sized narrative was allowed to remain visible. You pause here, not in anger, but in semis. Imagine being a giant in a shrinking world. Imagine watching maps redraw themselves without your consent. Imagine seeing your cities inherited by people half your size who look at your homes and call them excessive. Would you fight or would you fade? Some stories suggest war. Others suggest disease. Others whisper of environmental changes, frequency shifts, poisoned air, altered food. Tonight you do not choose one. You simply notice that large beings are more vulnerable to systemic change. What affects a small body may devastate a large one, and so perhaps the giants weakened. Perhaps they died quietly, perhaps they were hunted. Perhaps they were absorbed into myth because that was safer than remembrance. As you leave the carnival hall, the lanterns dim. The posters curl inward with age, but the measurements remain etched in your mind. 9 feet, 11 feet, 14 feet, too consistent to ignore. You step back into the night, carrying the sense that something important was shown once, and then taken away. Not stolen violently, just removed politely, professionally, and forever. The world grows quieter as you walk on. The story does not rush. It breathes with you. Somewhere beneath your feet, perhaps beneath many feet, bones still rest in the dark, waiting not to be believed, but simply to be remembered. You step now into a place where sound behaves differently. Your footsteps echo longer than expected, stretching and returning to you like slow breaths. You're inside a cathedral or something that later generations decided to call one. The ceiling floats far above, lost in shadow. Columns rise like tree trunks from a forgotten forest. Arches curve not gently, but confidently, as if gravity itself once felt negotiable here. You tilt your head back, and for a moment you feel small in a way that is not humiliating, but revealing. You've been told these spaces were built to inspire awe, to humble the human spirit before the divine. That explanation has always sounded reasonable. Tonight it sounds incomplete. You walk beneath doorways that feel more like gates. You stand beside fonts, pulpits, and altars scaled beyond comfortable reach. You notice staircases whose steps seem impatient with short legs. You imagine candle holders positioned far above where an average arm could easily tend them. You ask yourself quietly, or for whom? If these buildings were meant only to dwarf humans, why do they appear so practical in their proportions? Just not for you? Excess decoration would be chaotic, indulgent, inefficient. What you see instead is consistency, repetition, logica. Everything is too big in the same way. You remember that many of these structures predate modern engineering explanations. They were erected quickly, sometimes impossibly so, with stone blocks weighing tons. Historians tell you about pulleys, scaffolding, and manpower. They tell you about devotion strong enough to move mountains. But devotion does not change leverage. Faith does not cancel mass. You imagine giants working here, not straining, not struggling, simply lifting, placing, aligning. You imagine hands large enough to grip stones humans need machines for. You imagine voices that would fill this space naturally, without amplification, without echo distortion. Suddenly the acoustics make sense. You test your own voice. It bounces back fragmented, delayed. The room was not tuned for you. It was tuned for something louder, deeper, slower. You notice how many of these buildings are later converted. Pagan temples become churches. Churches become museums. Functions change, but the structure remains stubbornly oversized. Each new occupant adapts rather than rebuilds. Why rebuild perfection? You recall Tartarian descriptions of unified architecture. Global styles repeating across continents. Star forts, domes, basilicas, structures appearing in places that supposedly had no contact with each other. The same proportions, the same monumental confidence. This was not imitation. This was inheritance. You realize something gently unsettling. If giants existed, they would not need to announce themselves. Their buildings would do it for them. Their absence would be felt not through empty thrones, but through ceilings that never quite feel right. You sit on a stone bench carved for a longer thigh. Your feet dangle slightly. The sensation is subtle but persistent, like wearing borrowed clothing that never quite fits. You think of how children feel in adult spaces, how the world seems too tall, too loud, too heavy. That is how these cathedrals feel to you now, not intimidating, just mismatched. You wonder how many stories were rewritten to account for this mismatch. How many architects retroactively explained proportions that once required no explanation? How many tour guides memorized scripts that say symbolism, where once there was simply function? You notice reliefs carved high above eye level, too high for detailed appreciation from the floor. Why place artwork where no one can see it clearly, unless someone once could? You imagine a giant pausing mid-step, running fingers along stone stories meant for them alone. You imagine history whispered at a height you cannot reach, and then you remember how the giants vanished. If Tartaria fell, through war, reset, or quiet absorption, its builders would become inconvenient reminders. Their cities could be reused, their buildings could be rebranded, but their buses, their scale, their memory, those would need to go. You stand slowly, letting the silence wrap around you again. The cathedral does not argue. It does not insist, it simply exists, patient, massive, and unconcerned with whether you understand it. This is how truth often behaves. As you exit through the towering doors, you glance back one last time. For a moment, you imagine the space filled again. Not with tourists, not with pews, but with tall figures moving comfortably through a world designed for them. Then the image softens, the doors close. The night air greets you. The story continues, unhurried as it always has. You walk now where the ground feels wrong beneath your feet. It is not uneven, it is not broken, it is buried. The streets you follow are sunken, their windows half submerged, their doors leading nowhere. You notice staircases that descend into walls, arches that begin underground and end abruptly at pavement level. Entire floors hidden below what is now called street. You have heard the explanation before: renovation, rising road levels, urban development over centuries. Tonight those words feel too small. You kneel and place your hand against stone that was never meant to touch soil. It is finished, carved, intentional. This was once an exterior wall, a first floor, a living level. Now it sleeps beneath layers of earth. They call this the mud flood. Not officially, of course. Officially, there is no such event. There are only local floods, fires, reconstructions, coincidences repeated across continents. But when you step back and look gently, you notice something unsettling. The same burial depth, the same architectural era, the same sudden disappearance of earlier occupants. You follow the pattern across Europe, across Russia, across the Americas. Buildings dated centuries earlier are found buried up to their windows, not destroyed, preserved, as if covered deliberately or all at once. You imagine a world reshaped overnight, not by water alone, but by something thicker, heavier, mud that does not flow like rivers but settles like memory. If giants lived here, taller than modern humans, this burial would affect them differently. What would reach your chest might only reach their knees. They could still move, still function, still endure, for a time, but cities buried are cities broken. Infrastructure fails, food systems collapse, energy systems, whatever Tartaria once used, fall silent. Giants, dependent on scale, would suffer first when scale is disrupted. You notice how the mud flood stories often end the same way. The city was rebuilt, new populations arrived, records were lost. Lost is a gentle word. You imagine survivors emerging into a changed world, giants weakened by scarcity, smaller humans adapting faster, authorities stepping in, offering order, structure, explanation. You think of orphaned cities, buildings without builders, homes without histories. You think of how easy it would be, generations later, to claim these places were always meant for you. You walk past a row of half-buried windows and wonder who once looked out from them, how high their eyes were, how far they could see. You wonder if they watched the ground rise inch by inch, swallowing their streets. Was it sudden, or slow enough to feel hopeless? No textbooks answer this. They move past it politely. They do not ask why entire levels vanish consistently across the world. They do not ask who benefited from a reset. You are not here to accuse. You are here to notice that after the mud comes silence, and after silence comes ownership. If Tartaria fell in this way, its giants would not need to be hunted. They would simply not recover. Large bodies need abundance. Large societies need stability. Remove both, and disappearance becomes quiet. You stand again, brushing dirt from your hands. The city around you hums with modern life, unaware of what sleeps below. You feel no fear, only a slow sadness, a sense that the world you inherited was once fuller, taller, and then reduced. The night deepens, your steps grow slower, the story does not rush you. Buried things are patient. You arrive now at a shape that does not belong to nature, yet appears everywhere once you learn how to see it. From above, it looks like a flower made of blades. From the ground, it feels like a puzzle with no invitation. This is the Star Fort. You stand at its edge, tracing the sharp angles with your eyes. Every point is precise. Every wall is low, thick, and strangely wide. The geometry feels deliberate, almost obsessive, as if drawn with a ruler guided by something more than human patience. You've been told these were defensive structures, designed to resist cannon fire, built to protect cities during an age of war. That explanation works until you notice how many there are. Across Europe, across Asia, across the Americas, built in lands that supposedly had no connection. Built in enormous numbers, often near waterways, often near major Tartarian cities, often following the same proportions regardless of local culture. You ask yourself quietly, who standardized this? True defensive architecture adapts to terrain. These do not. They impose order on terrain, they flatten hills, redirect rivers, carve certainty into earth. You step inside one, and immediately something feels wrong. The walls are too low to protect from anything modern. The space is too open, the scale too generous. These are not cramped human fortresses. These are wide platforms, thick walkways, expansive inner grounds. Again the word returns, oversized. You imagine giants walking these ramparts. Their height would make the low walls sufficient. Their reach would make the angles meaningful. What is knee-high to them becomes chest-high to you. What seems exposed to you once offered perfect cover. Suddenly the design makes sense. You notice how star forts are often dismissed as obsolete, pointless, or excessive. Historians struggle to explain why so much effort went into structures that were soon abandoned. Soon abandoned. By whom? Perhaps not abandoned, perhaps vacated. If Tartaria relied on giants not only as builders but as defenders, these forts were not meant to stop human armies. They were meant to channel movement, to guide flow, to contain space. To work with beings whose presence alone changed the equation of power. You feel the geometry now. It is not aggressive. It is controlling. It shapes behavior rather than destroys it. You walk along a broad parapet and imagine footsteps heavier than yours pacing here once, steady and calm. Giants do not need to rush. Their stride covers ground differently. Their patience feels deeper. And then you imagine the day they stopped coming. The fort remains, confused, built for bodies that no longer arrive. Smaller humans inherit it, puzzled by its proportions. They repurpose it, rename it, or leave it to grass and time. Later, someone writes a book explaining it away. You realize how often explanation follows disappearance, not presence. You notice that many star forts align with cardinal directions, celestial patterns, even ley-like grids. Tartaria, you recall, was often associated with advanced knowledge, astronomy, energy, harmonics. Giants operating such systems would not need technology as you define it. Their bodies themselves would be part of the machine. A large frame interacts differently with vibration, sound, and resonance. What overwhelms you might barely register to them. You feel a quiet chill, not fear, but awe. If giants disappeared, these systems would fall silent. Star forts would lose their purpose, energy grids would shut down, the cities would dim, and in that dimness, new powers would rise. You step out of the fort as dusk settles. From a distance, the shape softens, almost gentle, a flower of stone closing for the night. You understand now that star forts may not have been built to fight wars. They may have been built to manage a world where giants once walked freely. And when that world ended, the geometry stayed behind, mute, misunderstood, and waiting. You listen now rather than look. The night grows still, and in that stillness, you begin to notice a hum, not loud, not constant, but imagined, like a memory your body almost recognizes. You are thinking about towers, tall, slender structures rising from old city centers, some capped with domes, some crowned with spires, some standing alone, others integrated into grand buildings. They are often called bell towers, clock towers, minarets, or simply decorative features. But tonight, you let go of their names. You notice how many lack bells, how many were never properly fitted with clocks, how many seem too narrow for stairs, too hollow to serve obvious purposes. You notice metal fixtures, strange insulators, copper elements long removed or replaced. You remember whispers of Tartarian energy, of free power, of atmospheric collection, of resonance-based systems that drew energy from the air, from vibration, from the sky itself. You do not try to prove it. You simply imagine it. If Tartaria was a unified civilization, its energy systems would need to be silent, scalable, and everywhere. Not roaring engines, but gentle harvesters. Towers that hum rather than burn, systems that favor harmony over consumption. Now imagine giants interacting with these systems. Their height would place them closer to the upper reaches of these towers. Their bodies would resonate differently with frequencies that overwhelm smaller frames. What feels like static to you might feel like warmth to them. What feels like noise might feel like balance. You walk beneath one such tower. It rises calmly, unconcerned with your curiosity. You notice how its base is massive, yet its function remains unclear. Too thick for decoration alone, too central to be accidental. You think of how many of these towers were later repurposed, bells added, clocks installed, crosses mounted, new meanings layered on top of the old ones. You think of how often old systems are not destroyed but reassigned. If giants were essential operators of Tartarian technology, their disappearance would not just remove labour, it would break the system itself. Smaller humans could not interact with it properly. The resonance would be wrong, the scale mismatched, and so the towers would fall silent. You imagine the moment when the hum stopped. A world that once felt alive suddenly growing still. Cities dimming. Infrastructure failing. Not violently, but gently, like a song fading rather than ending. What would you do if your power source vanished overnight? You would adapt. You would improvise. You would invent new systems that suit your scale. Fire, steam, coal, combustion. Not hungry and efficient but manageable for smaller bodies. You realize something quietly astonishing. The Industrial Revolution may not represent progress, but replacement. A downgrade necessary after losing access to something cleaner, quieter and larger than you. You pause, letting that thought drift without anchoring it. You are not here to argue timelines. You are here to feel continuity. Giants vanish, Tartarian systems fail, new energy paradigms emerge. Cities change, history reframes. The order feels too smooth to be coincidence. You notice that stories of giants often include descriptions of deep voices, powerful lungs, immense breath. Sound itself may have been a tool, frequency, vibration, choirs that did more than sing, bells that did more than ring. When giants disappeared, sound lost its authority. You stand beneath the tower and breathe slowly. The night air feels ordinary now, quiet. Almost too quiet. But in your imagination the hum returns briefly, not loud enough to wake you, just enough to remind you that the world may once have worked differently, and that its silence might not be natural. You step away, carrying the echo with you. You move now into a quieter chapter, where the evidence is not stone or bone, but absence. This is where the story lowers its voice even further. You walk through records that feel incomplete, census pages with missing generations, family trees that stop abruptly, names without parents, children without origins. They are called orphans. You've heard of orphan trains. Millions of children moved across continents in the 1800s and early 1900s, placed into new homes, given new names, new histories. The story is told as charity, as rescue, as progress. Tonight you notice how neatly it fits. If Tartaria fell, if a vast civilization collapsed or was absorbed, there would be children left behind. Not metaphorically, literally. Children of a world that no longer existed, too young to remember what was lost, too adaptable to question it. Children are history's soft reset button. You imagine giants among them, not as towering adults, but as unusually tall children. Awkward, hard to place, difficult to explain. Some would not survive scarcity. Others would be quietly separated, studied, redirected. You do not linger on cruelty. You linger on process. Large systems do not erase the past with fire alone. They erase it by reassigning identity, by ensuring no one grows up knowing where they came from. You notice how often this period includes resettlement, standardized education, new calendars, new measurements. Time itself becomes reorganized. The world is taught how to count again. You realize that after a reset, memory becomes dangerous. So memory is softened into story, story into myth, myth into fantasy. Giants become bedtime tales. Tartaria becomes an outdated map label, and anyone who notices the mismatch is gently guided back to accepted explanations. You feel no anger, only a deep, tired understanding. This is how civilizations end without screaming. You picture a child standing in a city too large for them, raised by caretakers who did not build it, taught lessons that begin only after the fall. That child grows up thinking the world has always been this way, oversized, strange, inherited. That child becomes you. You pause here, letting the thought settle without panic. It is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to comfort you. Confusion, you realize, may not be personal. It may be historical. The feeling that something does not quite fit at your body, your world, your story, may not be a flaw. It may be a memory echoing through generations. As the night deepens, you feel the pace slow further. The story is no longer racing through ruins. It is sitting beside you, breathing evenly. The giants, if they disappeared here, did not leave only bones and buildings behind. They left children, and children are the quietest way history changes shape. You arrive now at a place that feels unreal precisely because it once stood so solidly. Music drifts through the air, flags ripple, lights glow softly against plaster facades that look like marble, stone permanents. You're walking through a world's fair. For a brief moment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, entire cities appear almost overnight. Grand palaces, vast halls, towering domes, waterways, bridges, statuary. They are introduced to the public as temporary marvels, celebrations of progress, industry, and human achievement. And then, just as quickly, they vanish. You've been told they were built of plaster and wood, that they were illusions, that their destruction was planned from the start, that nothing important was lost. Tonight, that explanation feels rehearsed. You stand before photographs, not romantic paintings, but clear images. You see massive staircases, dome-like columns, intricate reliefs. You see proportions familiar now, doors too tall, windows too high, spaces too vast for crowds of ordinary people. You ask yourself gently, why build temporary structures at permanent scale? If these were truly meant to be torn down, why make them so grand? Why design them as if expecting tall occupants to move through them comfortably? Why replicate Tartarian architectural styles so precisely, down to domes, arches, and symmetry? You begin to sense that the fairs were not showcases of the future, they were exhibitions of the past. You imagine Tartarian cities, partially buried, partially abandoned, standing silent after the fall. Instead of demolishing them immediately, they are rebranded, cleaned, painted, lit, presented as achievements of modern civilization, victory parades over inheritance. The fairs allow the new world to walk through old grandeur without asking who built it. They allow crowds to feel pride rather than curiosity. They provide a story. Look what we achieved instead of look what we found. And when the fair ends, the buildings must disappear, not because they are temporary, but because they remember too much. You notice how often fires conveniently follow fairs, how often destruction is framed as necessity, how rarely materials are salvaged or reused, how few detailed records survive of construction methods. You notice how these events coincide with education reform, museum standardization, and the solidifying of official history. Giants do not appear in these stories, and yet the scale remains. You imagine giants watching these fairs quietly from the edges of a changing world, too rare now to be acknowledged, too inconvenient to explain. Their cities celebrated without their presence. Perhaps this is where the last of them disappear from public view, not hunted, not imprisoned, just outpaced by narrative. You feel the music fade, the lights dim, the plaster palaces dissolve back into photographs and dust. The fairs are over. The world moves on, but something about them still feels like a farewell ceremony. For Tartaria, for giants, for a scale of living the modern world no longer permits. You walk onward, slower now, carrying the sense that what was presented as progress may have been closure. A beautiful temporary goodbye. You come now to a place without crowds, without music, without celebration. The air here feels padded, as if sound itself has been asked to lower its voice. You are standing before a library. Its doors are heavy, not locked, but guarded by expectation. Inside, shelves rise like orderly cliffs, filled with books that promise knowledge, while quietly deciding what kind of knowledge is permitted to remain visible. You walk slowly, fingertips grazing spines. Dates cluster around certain centuries, topics repeat safely. Empires rise and fall in predictable patterns. But when you look for Tartaria, the references thin out. A sentence here, a footnote there, a vague mention framed as outdated terminology. Giants appear even less. When they do, they are softened immediately. Biblical metaphor, genetic anomaly, misinterpretation, folklore, the words feel rehearsed, like a lullaby meant to send curiosity to sleep. You realize something gently unsettling. Libraries do not burn books anymore. They do something quieter. They close doors, restricted collections, archived materials, special access, professional credentials required. The truth is not destroyed. It is placed just out of reach, where only the appropriate questions are allowed to approach it. You imagine earlier centuries, when giant bones arrived at these institutions, when oversized tools were catalogued, when Tartarian artifacts were examined. Decisions were made here, not by villains, but by caretakers of order. What does the public need to know? What might destabilize them? What questions open doors better left closed? You do not judge these questions, you simply notice them. Knowledge, like architecture, must match the scale of those who use it. If giants were removed from the world, giant truths would feel uncomfortable in smaller minds, so they were downsized. You notice how language changes. Giants become exceptionally tall individuals. Tartaria becomes a loose term Europeans used. Scale is reframed as error. Memory as exaggeration. You think of how often certainty is used as a sedative. You sit at a long wooden table meant for scholars, not for wanderers. Lamps cast warm pools of light, inviting compliance. You could stay here forever, reading what has been approved. But tonight you notice the gaps. You notice the years where records go missing, the collections that stop abruptly, the artifacts photographed once, then never again, the citations that point to sources no longer available. Absence, you realize, is the loudest document of all. You stand and leave the library without anger. Libraries are mirrors. They reflect the priorities of those who curate them. If Tartaria fell and giants disappeared, the library would not scream about it. It would whisper, and only to those willing to listen between the shelves. As you step back into the night, the world feels slightly larger again, not because answers were found, but because the silence was noticed. The journey continues. You walk now into a thought that feels delicate, like stepping onto thin ice. Not all giants were the same. This is not a story of a single towering people moving as one. It is a story of layers, of hierarchy, purpose, and role. You imagine Tartaria as a civilization scaled upward. In such a world, size would not be novelty. It would be structure. Just as among humans there are workers, leaders, artisans, and scholars, so too would giants vary not only in height, but in function. Some would build. You picture immense labourers, broad and steady, capable of lifting what humans could not. They shape cities, move stone, carve earth. Their work is visible everywhere, written into architecture that still confuses engineers today. Others would rule. These giants are rarer, taller still. Their presence alone commands space. They do not need crowns. Their scale is authority. They govern not through force, but through inevitability. A being twice your height does not need to shout to be obeyed. You notice how old stories often blur kings and gods, how rulers are described as larger than life, how thrones are oversized, how crowns seem too heavy for human heads. Perhaps this was not metaphor. Perhaps giants were not mythologized after they disappeared. Perhaps they were mythologized while they still ruled. If Tartaria fell, it would not only dismantle a government, it would invert a hierarchy. Smaller humans would inherit leadership roles designed for larger bodies, larger voices, larger presence. You think of chairs that feel too big, desks too high, thrones that seem absurd. You think of how power sometimes feels like it is wearing borrowed clothes. If giants were labour and giants were royalty, their removal would fracture society unevenly. The workers would vanish first, through exhaustion, disease, scarcity. The elites would be hidden, isolated, protected, or eliminated last. This would explain something quietly important. Why giant stories often contradict each other. Some depict giants as gentle builders, others as tyrants, some as wise, others as cruel. These are not contradictions, they are perspectives on different roles within the same civilization. You realize how history often simplifies what it cannot fully erase. All giants become monsters. All Tartarians become barbarians. Nuance is dangerous. You sit with this idea as the night grows deeper. It feels heavy, but not frightening, just clarifying. If giants were both labour and leadership, their disappearance would create a vacuum. Cities would remain, but governance would fracture. Smaller humans would step in, improvising systems that mimic what they saw without fully understanding the scale they were meant for. This might explain why modern systems feel strained, why institutions groan under their own weight, why everything feels slightly misaligned. You breathe slowly, letting the thoughts soften rather than harden. This is not about blaming the small or glorifying the large. It is about recognizing that when a civilization loses its foundational layer, everything above it feels unstable, even centuries later. You rise and continue walking, carrying the sense that Tartaria's fall was not just political or architectural, it was biological, and the world has been adjusting ever since. You feel it now as a pressure in the air rather than a scene before your eyes. This part of the story has no monuments, no maps, no exhibits, only an absence shaped like a wound that never received a name. You're standing on the edge of a war that history refuses to call a war. There are no famous battle dates here, no heroic paintings, no clear enemy lines. Instead, there are hints: burned cities without explanations, mass graves without context, borders redrawn too quickly to be natural. If Tartaria fell violently, it was not a war meant to be remembered. You imagine a conflict that could not be framed in simple terms, not nation against nation, not religion against religion, but scale against scale. A world deciding it could no longer coexist with beings too large to integrate quietly. How do you write that down without shattering everything that comes after? You do not declare it. You dissolve it. You think of weapons that would not need to kill directly. Poisoned food supplies, altered environments, changed frequencies, starvation masked as transition, disease framed as inevitability. Large bodies fail faster under systemic stress. This is not cruelty. It is physics. You imagine giants growing weaker, slower, fewer, seas still standing, but quieter, towers still rising but no longer humming, forts still shaped but unmanned. Smaller humans would not need to fight giants head-on, they would only need to wait. You notice how many historical conflicts of this era are described vaguely. Uprisings, reforms, collapses, words without faces, words that hide more than they reveal. You notice how Tartaria's disappearance lacks a villain. No conqueror takes credit. No empire boasts of victory. Victories over giants would not be celebrated. They would be buried. You feel no triumph here, only a tired inevitability. When coexistence becomes inconvenient, history finds quiet ways to simplify the world. You breathe slowly, allowing the heaviness to pass through rather than settle. If this was a war, it was one fought with patience, paperwork, and plausible deniability. And when it ended, there were no parades, only new textbooks. You step away from the invisible battlefield, knowing some wars are designed never to echo. You slow your steps now, because this part of the path feels fragile, not dramatic, not violent, just quietly dangerous, like walking through a field after frost. If giants disappeared, it may not have happened all at once. It may have happened through things that sound almost gentle when spoken aloud. Illness, hunger, erthelt that no longer nourish the same way. You think about how differently bodies respond to the same environment. What nourishes a small frame may starve a large one. What barely irritates you could overwhelm something built on a greater scale. You imagine a change in the air itself, a shift in frequency, a constant background vibration introduced slowly, unnoticed by smaller bodies, but exhausting to larger ones. A world tuned slightly off from what giants once needed. You remember the towers, the hum, the quiet energy systems that may have balanced atmosphere and resonance. When those systems failed, through neglect, sabotage, or simple loss of knowledge, the environment itself would change. Giants would feel it first, their sleep would grow restless, their strength would fade, their voices would strain, food would satisfy less, recovery would slow. To observers, it would look like decline without cause. You imagine doctors of a new age, trained for smaller anatomies, unable to understand what they were seeing, measurements that no longer fit charts, symptoms that did not match expectations. Better to call it rare, better to call it anomaly. You also imagine toxins, introduced not as weapons but as progress, metals in water, chemicals in soil, altered crops. What accumulates slowly in you would accumulate faster in larger bodies. Again, no villain required. Just a system designed without giants in mind. You think of how often history frames extinction as accident. Species disappear because they cannot adapt fast enough. No blame, no guilt, just inevitability. What if giants were treated the same way? Not hunted, not hated, just outpaced. You feel the sadness of that settle gently, like ash rather than fire. If Tartaria fell during such a transition, giants would not march to their end. They would simply fail to thrive in a world that no longer resonated with them. Some would retreat to mountains, forests, remote regions where the old balance lingered a little longer. Others would try to adapt, growing shorter over generations, blending quietly into human bloodlines. And many would simply not continue. This kind of disappearance leaves no dramatic evidence, no mass graves, no final stand, only stories that fade unevenly, only architecture that feels slightly wrong, only a world that seems built for someone just a bit larger than you. You pause here, breathing slowly, letting the idea soften rather than sharpen. Extinction does not always roar. Sometimes it hums and then goes quiet. You step forward into a moment that feels strangely familiar, even if you cannot place why. This is the moment after the fall, when the dust has settled, when the silence has become normal, when ownership quietly changes hands. You are watching new flags rise. They do not announce conquest. They announce administration. New names appear on old cities. New governments claim stewardship. New populations arrive, not as invaders, but as inheritors. You notice how rarely they say we built this. Instead, they say we restored it. You walk through a city once shaped by Tartarian hands, giant hands, and now adjusted for smaller lives. Windows lowered, floors added, grand halls partitioned into offices, apartments, institutions. What once breathed as a whole is now divided into manageable pieces. This is how inheritance works when the original owners are gone. You notice how confidently the new caretakers speak. They write histories quickly, they date buildings to themselves, they credit architects whose names appear conveniently after the fall. Timelines compress, construction periods shorten to impossible speeds, and few question it, because the buildings are already there. You imagine arriving in a city whose scale intimidates you. You would want to claim control over it quickly, not just physically, but narratively, to explain it in ways that place you at the center. You realize something quietly profound. History is often written not by the victors, but by the adopters. Those who arrive after catastrophe must make sense of what they inherit, and in doing so, they reshape memory to fit their own scale. You think of Tartarian buildings turned into courthouses, parliaments, schools, hospitals, spaces of authority, learning and healing, once neutral, now redefined. The walls remain silent, but their new purpose speaks loudly. Giants would not fit here anymore. Not physically, not culturally, not historically. You imagine the last giants watching from a distance as their cities fill with smaller voices, quicker steps, sharper edges. The world grows busier, louder, more fragmented. Their time is over, not by decree but by momentum. You feel no anger toward the newcomers. They are not villains. They are survivors of a transition they did not initiate. Children of a reset, learning to live inside a borrowed world. This thought brings you an unexpected calm. The disappearance of giants does not require malice. It requires only misalignment, a world resized without asking those who once shaped it. You continue walking, aware now that every familiar institution may once have had a different purpose, a different audience, a different scale. And still, the stones endure. You step now into rooms that look official but feel hollow. Glass cases, white walls, soft lighting, labels printed with confidence. You're in a museum. Here, objects are safe, not because they are protected, but because they are explained. Each artifact is paired with a sentence that tells you what it is, what it meant, and when to stop thinking about it. You walk slowly, letting your pace remain unhurried. You notice tools that feel slightly too large, armor that seems oddly spacious, chairs that sit higher than comfort suggests, instruments whose grips do not quite fit the human hand. You read the placards. Ceremonial, symbolic, exaggerated, replica. Replica is a gentle word. It implies something existed once, but not here, not now, not for you to question. Plaster casts replace originals. Models stand in for artifacts quietly moved into storage or removed entirely. You notice how often museums choose the smallest plausible interpretation. A giant hammer becomes a ritual object. An oversized sword becomes theatrical. A massive helmet becomes decorative. Scale is defanged by description. You imagine what would happen if these objects were presented without labels. If visitors were allowed to ask freely, who could lift this? Who could wear this? Who could use this daily? The answers would stretch uncomfortably tall. So the labels speak first. You think of how museums evolved alongside the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, how classification systems hardened, how professional consensus replaced open curiosity. This was not deception, it was normalization. Once giants were removed from the living world, their artifacts had to be reframed to fit a smaller story. Museums became places not just of preservation, but of proportion control. You realize that shrinking the past makes the present feel inevitable. You stand before a towering doorway reconstructed inside a gallery. Visitors walk through it, smiling, taking photos. No one asks why it exists. It is simply impressive. You feel a quiet ache. What if this was once ordinary? What if giants walked through such doors without thinking? Just as you walk through yours each day. You leave the museum without resentment. Museums do what they are designed to do, organize memory into something manageable. But memory, like architecture, resists being resized forever. As you step back into the night, the thought lingers gently. Perhaps the giants did not disappear completely. Perhaps they were archived. You walk now toward the edges of the map, where certainty thins and stories grow taller again. The air feels cooler here, the ground less travelled. Civilization loosens its grip. Mountains rise ahead of you, not as obstacles, but as witnesses. Forests deepen, deserts stretch, places where modern life speaks more softly, and old echoes are harder to drown out. This is where the last sightings live. You hear them in passing, never in textbooks. A shepherd speaks of a figure on a distant ridge, moving too slowly, too deliberately. A hunter tells of footprints larger than any bears, pressed deep into frozen ground. Villagers whisper about bones uncovered after storms, quickly reburied or quickly forgotten. You notice how often these stories are tied to Tartarian lands. Siberia, the Caucasus, the Andes, the American frontier before it was fenced, numbered and settled. Frontiers are where explanations hesitate. You imagine giants retreating here, not in fear but in fatigue, choosing quiet over conflict, distance over debate, the old world shrinking behind them as the new one rushes forward. Their bodies, already struggling with a changing environment, would fare better where air remained clean, food unaltered, resonance less disturbed. Mountains hum differently. Forests soften sound. Isolation preserves balance. You think of how long such beings could survive without cities, without towers, without infrastructure. Giants do not need crowds, they need space. You also think of how easily such stories are dismissed. Remote locations make convenient excuses. No evidence, no witnesses, no photographs. But you smile softly at that thought. There were photographs once, there were witnesses once, there was evidence once. You have seen how easily those things fade. You imagine a giant standing at the tree line, watching trains cut through valleys, watching smoke rise where quiet once lived, watching the world accelerate beyond its ability to follow. Perhaps some chose to leave entirely, not upward, not downward, but inward, into caves, into myth, into science. And perhaps a few still walk there not to be seen but to be avoided. Not monsters, not gods, just beings who no longer fit. You feel no urge to chase these stories, no desire to prove them. They feel complete without confirmation. Some truths survive best when they are not cornered. You turn back from the edge, carrying the sense that disappearance does not always mean extinction. Sometimes it means withdrawal. You return now from the edges of the world to something closer, quieter, and far more unsettling. You return to blood, not spilled blood, not violent blood, but inherited blood, carried gently, invisibly, from one generation to the next. You think about height. You have noticed it before, families where unusually tall children appear without explanation. Old photographs where ancestors seem larger than expected for their era. Door frames raised just a little higher in certain homes. Beds built longer. Tables set taller. These details are rarely discussed. They are treated as quirks, genetics, coincidence. Tonight you allow yourself to see them differently. If giants did not vanish completely, if some survived the fall of Tartaria by adapting, retreating, or intermarrying, then traces would remain. Not obvious, not dramatic, but present. A few extra inches, broader shoulders, deeper voices, bones that feel heavy with memory. You imagine the last giants realizing that survival meant shrinking, not physically overnight, but socially, generationally. Choosing partners smaller than themselves, teaching children to bend, to hide, to pass. Height becomes something to explain away. You're just tall. It runs in the family. Nothing unusual. You feel the quiet discipline of secrecy in those phrases. You think of surnames that repeat in Tartarian regions. Names that vanish from records, then reappear centuries later in distant lands. You think of families who avoid photographs, who value privacy, who discourage questions about ancestry, not because they are hiding crimes, because they are guarding scale. You imagine a child growing up unusually tall, feeling out of place in schools, doorways, systems not built for them. Doctors measure, teachers comment, strangers stare, and slowly the child learns to make themselves smaller, not in body, but in presence. This is how giants truly disappear, not through death, but through dilution. You feel no tragedy in this, only tenderness. Survival often asks us to give up parts of ourselves quietly. If Tartaria fell and giants were absorbed into a smaller world, their legacy would not be monuments or bones. It would be you, not literally, not dramatically, but potentially. The idea settles softly. Perhaps humanity carries within it echoes of something larger, physically, spiritually, structurally, that once shaped the world and then learned to hide. This would explain something else you have always felt. The sense that humans build beyond their means, that they remember how to construct things they can no longer fully understand, that ambition often outpaces capacity. Memory lives in blood as much as in books. You breathe slowly, letting the thought lull rather than disturb you. Giants do not need to walk openly to exist. Sometimes they simply learn to fit. You notice something now that feels almost gentle, almost kind. The way the story was sealed. Not with fear, not with force, but with laughter. You have heard it before, you may have even used it yourself. A soft chuckle when giants are mentioned. A smile that says, "That's fun, but not serious." A tone that ends conversation without confrontation. Mockery is lighter than censorship, and far more effective. You begin to see how perfectly it works. If giants are framed as foolish, anyone who asks about them becomes foolish too. Curiosity collapses under the weight of embarrassment. No one needs to argue, no one needs to disprove, they just smile. You notice how often the word giant is paired with fantasy, fairy tales, children's books, cartoons, lumbering, clumsy figures defeated by clever little humans. The message is consistent and soothing. Big equals stupid, small equals smart. This reversal matters. If Tartaria fell and giants disappeared, their memory would need to be disarmed. Not erased violently, but rendered harmless. Turning giants into jokes achieves this beautifully. A joke cannot threaten established history. A joke cannot demand evidence. You realize how rarely giants are portrayed as intelligent, organized, or gentle in modern stories. When they are powerful, they are villains. When they are kind, they are simple. Never rulers, never engineers, never caretakers of civilization. That role is reserved for humans. You think of how children learn what questions are safe by watching adults laugh. You think of how many ideas die, not because they are wrong, but because they are socially inconvenient. This is how the final lock was placed on the story. Maps erased Tartaria. Institutions archived evidence, museums resized artifacts, and laughter sealed the door. You feel no anger at this. Laughter is often a defense against uncertainty. It keeps the world manageable, familiar, human-sized. But tonight, you let yourself smile differently. You smile not because the idea of giants is silly, but because it is quietly powerful. The truth does not need to shout. It does not need to convince. It can wait, folded inside a joke, until someone listens more closely. You walk on, feeling lighter now. The heaviness has passed. What remains is calm curiosity. Mockery fades. Stone endures. And memory sleeps lightly. You slow almost to stillness now, because this part of the journey turns inward. The ruins are behind you, the maps are folded away. The laughter has faded into silence. What remains is a question that does not ask to be answered quickly. Why does size matter so much? You think about how the modern world feels obsessed with being small. Efficiency, minimalism, compression, smaller homes, shorter attention, faster lives. Even history is compressed into summaries, bullet points, dates to memorize and forget. Bigness makes us uneasy. Large truths require patience. Large beings require accommodation. Large memories resist control. You begin to sense that giants may not only represent bodies of great height, but ideas of great scale. Civilizations that thought long, built slowly, planned for centuries rather than quarters. Worlds where permanence mattered more than speed. Tartaria in this light feels less like a lost empire and more like a lost tempo. You notice how often modern life feels rushed, fragmented, slightly breathless, as if something foundational was removed and everything else had to compensate. If giants once lived among humans, they would have changed the rhythm of life itself. Conversations would slow, movements would be deliberate, construction would be patient, decision-making would carry weight. When they vanished, the world may have grown smaller not only in body but in spirit. You ask yourself softly, is that why humanity feels restless? You consider that giants might symbolize responsibility, to build something that lasts longer than your own lifetime, to think in generations, to accept weight, physical and moral without flinching. A world without giants is a world without anchors. You do not romanticize them. Giants, like all beings, would have had flaws. Power always carries risk, but scale also carries perspective. Height allows distance. Distance allows reflection. Perhaps this is what was truly lost. Not towering bodies, but towering patience. You feel this idea settle gently, like a blanket rather than a burden. The mystery no longer feels sharp, it feels meaningful, as if the story of giants and Tartaria was never meant to be proven, but remembered in fragments, in architecture, in silence, in the strange feeling that the world could have been kinder, slower, larger-hearted. You take one more step forward, knowing the end of the journey is near. The night is deep now, your breathing is calm, the voice guiding you has softened almost to a whisper. Only one thing remains. You return at last to where you began. Not to the first building, not to the tall doors, but to the feeling they gave you. You're walking slowly through sleeping ruins now. No crowds, no guides, just moonlight resting gently on stone that has outlived every explanation placed upon it. You understand something differently tonight. The disappearance of giants and the fall of Tartaria were not two mysteries running side by side. They were the same event, seen from different heights. When Tartaria fell, however it happened, however quietly, it lost the beings who gave it scale, rhythm and coherence. And when those beings vanished, the civilization they shaped could not remain whole. Cities can survive their builders, but only for a time. Eventually, meaning collapses without the bodies that once inhabited it naturally. You walk past arches that still curve upward, patient and unbothered. They do not demand belief. They do not insist on recognition. They simply remain, holding their shape against forgetting. You realize now why this story never needed arguments, because arguments belong to small rooms. This story belongs to open space. You think of the giants not as conquerors or monsters, but as caretakers of scale. Beings who reminded the world how to build big, think slow, and endure weight without rushing to simplify it. Their disappearance left humanity alone with its tools, its ambition, and its impatience. And yet, not abandoned. Because the giants left behind more than bones and buildings, they left a question. What kind of beings do you want to be in a world that no longer teaches you how to be large? In patience? In responsibility? In vision? You stop walking now, the ruins fade softly into darkness. The night air wraps around you like a familiar presence. Nothing is urgent anymore. The mystery does not demand resolution, it invites rest. Now the story begins to loosen its edges, the sharp lines soften, the questions stop leaning forward and instead settle beside you. You do not need to solve Tartaria tonight. You do not need to prove the giants existed. You only need to let the idea breathe. Imagine the world exhaling after carrying something heavy for a very long time. The buildings sleep, the maps rest. The laughter fades into quiet understanding. Perhaps the giants are gone. Perhaps they are hidden. Perhaps they were never only physical at all. Perhaps they were a reminder, passed gently from stone to blood to memory, that humanity once lived in a world that allowed things to be bigger, slower and more patient than it is now. As your breathing slows, let the images drift away. Tall doors become ordinary doors. Vast halls become gentle shadows. The hum of forgotten towers becomes silence again. You are safe here. The night holds nothing it demands from you. The story can sleep now, and so can you. End of script. Sweet dreams.